people who use stimulants like Adderall, Vyvanse, like if I prescribe those, the, the risk of developing psychosis if you use that and smoke weed is very high, right?
Wow.
And I often tell people it's like driving 90 miles per hour is not a guaranteed car accident. Adding Adderall, so 90 miles per hour is the marijuana. Adding Adderall is like closing your eyes. Like it's not a matter of when you are going to crash. It's not a matter of if you are. It is when you are going to. The THC that you're smoking, if it is strong, you are likely to be going to the hospital anyway due to psychosis, right?
The,
Like it is not one time. It is not chronic use that causes issues all the time. It's actually heavy content.
the
I actually
strength.
encourage
The
patients
strength seems
sometimes.
to be a
Yeah,
bigger indicator of it. All right, guys, welcome to the Addiction Mindset Recovery Coaching YouTube channel. Today, I am very excited to be interviewing Dr. Joseph Alfar. He is a psychiatrist, and we're going to be talking about psychosis. We're going to be having a discussion about cannabis and cannabis metabolism, and then we're going to talk about common misconceptions when it comes to cannabis consumption. And if you guys wind up enjoying the presentation that Dr. Alfar is going to be giving to us today, you can find him on social media. He has his handle right there at Joseph Alfar MD on TikTok and YouTube. And Dr. Alfar, I'm just thrilled to have you on today, and I'm looking very forward to this. I know you got a good presentation put together, so I'm going to sit back and listen. I'll chime in if I have questions, and I hope viewers leave questions in the comments below when they watch this video, because who knows, maybe we can do a part 2 if it's well received.
yeah. Thank you for that very generous introduction. By the way, please call me Joe Frank throughout the whole. If Dr. Frank, you can call me
Very
Joe.
good.
It's totally fine.
Frank, too. Right back at you.
All right, easy. So before I start, I just did want to say, when I have patients struggling with cannabis who want to stop, I often refer them to your videos on YouTube. I've been a fan of yours for a very long time. I think you have this ability to create a community. You're like a one-person community in a lot of ways, and just a big fan of what you're doing. And I think you've helped a lot more people out there than you know.
That's a huge compliment. That gives me kind of goosebumps. It really does. That's very sincere, and I appreciate that. That's very meaningful. Thank you.
Of course. All right. So let's get started. So I tried to keep this scientific enough to be interesting, but not too scientific that people's eyes start glazing over. So let's start here. All right. Oh, we got to start with the disclaimers. A good portion preparing this came from reviewing Dr. Eric Mesamore. He has a YouTube channel, Ask a Psychiatrist, and Dr. David Pewter, MD. He has a really good podcast, Psychiatry and Psychotherapy. They are really good doctors. They have much better information than whatever I'm going to give you today. They really put in a lot of work in their craft, and I just want to direct there and give kudos to them for the help in preparing this. So this disclaimer tackles a common myth I get on my videos. So whenever I post about THC or cannabis, I get, you're like an industry plant or something. Like the pharmaceutical companies are paying me to talk badly about THC. So I receive no compensation from any pharmaceutical company. Congress passed some.
I'm glad you said that real quick. I get this all the time. People on my channel be like, "You're just pushing big pharma propaganda." I'm like, I am a chiropractor. I am an addiction recovery coach. I take supplements openly on my channel. I am the farthest thing from pharmaceuticals, and I'm all for pharmaceuticals. I have nothing against them, but I'm like, I am the farthest thing possible. That is such a common thing, and I'm glad you brought that up with the Sunshine Act. You just made me think of that real quick.
So yeah, I mean, look, the thing is, any doctor that receives any money from a pharmaceutical company, I'm talking down to the paid lunch when the pharma rep comes to the office, it has to be recorded on openpaymentsdata.cms.gov. And funny enough, I actually can't even find myself on it. If you type in Alfar, you'll actually find my brother, who's a dentist. He's not a physician, but you'll see. You could type in your doctor. You could type in any doctor you know. Most of the time, you'll find like food and beverage, because like the pharma rep comes with some lunch. But just to be clear, right? There are some people on there who have like millions of dollars or hundreds of thousands of dollars. Those people are not pharma plants either. Just to be you know, clear about that. These are people who worked with the pharmaceutical company, like as a principal investigator or as a consultant, and got paid from them for real work. So just to be clear, you could check me, right? If I get paid from pharma, but no, doctors don't even get paid that way. We don't get paid to prescribe, and we could definitely talk about that if that ever comes up. But just wanted to make that part clear. Um, the next part is I receive no money from any policy advocate or political groups. Any active income I've ever made in my position as a physician has been a result of clinical work. All of my opinions are mine. They don't represent anyone but me. And nothing I talk about here today should be received or misconstrued as medical advice. And this is not in any way a patient-doctor relationship. I am a psychiatrist, but I'm probably not your psychiatrist, unless you're one of my patients watching this. Base positions and my own motivations about being vocal about this. Because once again, right, I get this question a lot, like, now talk about alcohol, right? Now talk about whatever, right? Anyway, I'm going to get to that, but I just want to make it clear here, right? Addiction is highly stigmatized. Any sort of substance use, and even if you're saying marijuana is not addictive, fine. Any sort of substance use, as you know, extremely stigmatized, even in the medical community, right? And that's a pretty disturbing thing. But I want to make it kind of clear. When I talk about THC, I don't hate people who use marijuana or alcohol or nicotine or any substance under the sun. I don't hate them. I don't look down on them. They're people trying to help themselves, right? That's why they're using it. I'm sure you get this a lot, Frank. People kind of feel judged even if you talk about it with them.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. I'll say things online that really have nothing to do. It's just like sometimes I'm like, oh, I took a cold shower to quit smoking weed and it helped. I don't know that I've ever said that, but I'll say something as like controversial as that, and people will immediately think in the comments like, how dare you attack me? You don't know what I've been. You don't know why I smoke. Don't you realize I have, God forbid, cancer or MS, and smoking weed helps me? I'm like, whoa, 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 whoa. I didn't say it didn't. I just said when I was quitting, taking cold showers helped, which I don't think I've ever said taking cold showers helped directly. But you get my point. I'll say something very non-controversial, a little mindset. I'll be like, if you're struggling with addiction, think about what you're gaining back versus giving up. And people be like, how dare you speak about the plant that way? Or, yeah, why aren't you focused on alcohol? And I'm like, well, alcohol is not I wasn't addicted to alcohol. I had an addiction to cannabis. So that's more of what I care about, But yeah, I all the time. Yeah. It's actually fascinating seeing how people interpret. Just interest. That's a whole nother topic. Just people's interpretation of things, right? I say something and I expect it to be interpreted one way, and the 30% of the people that watch it interpret it completely different than what I anticipated. Really, it's fascinating, actually, to me.
Yeah. So I guess I wanted to really make it clear. That's why I'm being so redundant about it, right? Like, this is almost a weird thing to say as a doctor, right? But like, I love my patients, like I really do. I love them as people, and I want them to do well in life, right? Even the people who are struggling, who are not my patients, right? Like I truly want them to do better, and I want them to feel better. I'm not interested in kind of like judging them, right? That's not what I'm here to do. This is another point that gets brought up occasionally, right? I'm never talking from a legal perspective, but just from a legal perspective, I'm not in favor of criminalizing drug use at all, right? Not just marijuana, right? Any of it, to be quite honest with you, right? People who use substances, the way I understand it, are suffering, not criminals, right? So they don't need to be punished. They need help. So I'm totally against the idea of throwing somebody into jail for using a drug, right? That doesn't make sense to me, right? That's addressing a different kind of problem. And it's not lost on me that these laws have been weaponized against marginalized communities to throw Black and brown people in jail for smoking weed, right? That's a real thing. I want to make sure that when we talk about this, I'm talking about the science of it. I'm not talking about the legal aspects of it. I'm not talking about any specific community. Every community suffers as a result of drug use, right? So I want to make sure we just say that so we're mindful of it. And the last part is, I'm vocal about this subject because the risks of THC are very understated in the public consciousness, right? I see adolescents, and every now and then I'll get like a 16-year-old kid who is otherwise a very good kid, like doesn't do anything, wrong, but has a little anxiety, and he's gotten a lot worse because he started smoking weed. But he would never touch alcohol or nicotine or anything, but he touched marijuana because it's harmless, right? So when people ask me like, well, why don't you talk about alcohol? Like, I'm not endorsing alcohol because of talking about the risks of weed, but kids don't know. People don't know. Adults don't know, right? That this is some pretty dangerous stuff. And in this discussion, we'll talk about why it's dangerous, but this is why I'm vocal about it, right? Because it's a real problem, and it's becoming commercialized and pushed into people's faces. So that and look, I could go ahead. I know you actually had a video on this about this company that sent an email about it. The high as a kite thing.
Yes, it was a medical dispensary that was sending out, that was just their email marketing, flash deal, get high as a kite. And I was like, imagine if an opioid company was sending that to their patients, like extra strength opioids, 30% discount today only. Like they'd be in big trouble. Like that would not fly. So when we talk about it medically, I don't understand. I don't understand, I guess, the regulations on it. How can a state licensed medical dispensary be sending out emails to that to their patients? That to me is like super disturbing. It's actually it's crazy the type of emails that some of these medical licensed regulated medical dispensaries send. And on this note too, I want to say something else. I get where you're coming from about being vocal about it. A lot of younger people and older people will say to me, it's God's plant. God created this plant. And I'm not saying this from a religious standpoint, but I'm like, okay, if God created that plant, like what's the tobacco plant? What's the opium plant? What's the cocaine? What's the whatever cocaine comes from? What's the cocaine plant? What are grains that make alcohol then? Like, yes, most drugs start with a plant. Like pharmaceuticals, a lot of pharmaceuticals start with plants. Like that's just the way statin drugs for cholesterol. That's
cyanide.
Right?
Cyanide is also natural too, right? Like cyanide kills you, right? Like it's also natural. Alpha toxin in mushrooms is also natural, gives you liver cancer, right? Like we are barely alive, right? We're in civilization, right? Like but nature is scary, right? Like nature is not trying to keep you alive. It has no interest in keeping you alive, right? That's not. So yeah, we will get into that, as well a little bit. But yeah, that's once again, I think that's a ridiculous argument, right? Because fire is natural, water is natural. Water could, grow a garden, and it can also drown you, right? So it's not. That's a poor argument. I should tell you, I in undergrad I studied philosophy, so I am like a professional arguer. I don't argue that much anymore, but that's that would be a fallacious argument if somebody were to seriously make it. So myth number 2, people know it's dangerous, right? So my whole thing about being vocal is, Dr. Alfar, you are over exaggerating. People know it's dangerous. Well, I could say anything I want. You could say anything you want. Let's look at the data, right? This study, which I linked up there, they reached out for respondents in the U.S. 9,000 people responded. 81% of adults believe marijuana has at least one benefit. 17% believe it had none. The most common benefit was pain management, treatment of diseases such as epilepsy, MS, anxiety, stress, depression. 91% of adults believe it has at least one risk. 50% of the people believe that risk was legal problems. That was the biggest risk of marijuana use, followed by addiction, impaired memory. 30% agree that smoking marijuana prevents health problems. 1/3 of adults believe that smoking marijuana prevents health problems. 18% believe secondhand smoke is somewhat or completely safe. 7.6% believe it is safe for children. Of the respondents, 7.3 believe marijuana is completely safe during pregnancy, and 22.4 believe that marijuana is not at all addictive. So I actually tried to find a comparable study for like US perception of alcohol, but I couldn't. Like they can't even publish a study that stupid. Excuse me, right? Because
I understand. Yes.
because everyone knows alcohol is bad for you. Imagine 30% of people agree that alcohol prevents health issues, right? That there's nowhere on the planet you would find that, right? But for some reason, alcohol, THC, enjoys this sort of angelic PR, right? And that's a real problem.
Yeah, it's a massive issue. That study's actually shocking to me too. That's very interesting.
Yeah. Myth number 3: I smoked weed as a teen and I was fine. So this is coming from the parents, right? Or older adults who might be watching this. Look, I'm in my early 30s, so I'm actually not even in this age group. But people who are in their 40s and 50s smoked marijuana in the 80s or 90s, or even maybe early 80s, right? And they'll tell you, listen, man, like I smoked it. I was a little silly. I was a little giggly. I had some food with my friends, and that was it, right? Well, between this study done by El Sahli and his group, they looked at marijuana confiscated by the DEA, and they sampled from 1995 to 2014. They collected over 38,000 samples. So they did it. It's not just like 5 samples, right? The THC concentration in the plant, in the flower, went up 300%, from 4% to 12%, 3 times the amount of THC concentration. And there's a reason why I'm focusing on THC. According to the DEA, the vape devices, the vape cartridges, contain up to 80% THC concentration, right? This is, as I put here, the marijuana today in any form is rarely your dad's or your grandfather's marijuana, right? This is not the giggly kind. And there's another study that shows, I didn't cite it in here, but the increase, actually no, it is in that study by that study. The CBD concentration also got reduced. So it's not just that the THC went up, the CBD went down, and the ratio is off by 14%, 14x, so 1400%, right? So Frank, I saw a TikTok the other day. I actually couldn't believe this. You know, it was these 2 parents who they're like, when our kid gets home and he smells like weed, and they were like pretending to be like upset with him, right? They're like, we're gonna talk about this tomorrow, and then like the kid walks away, and then mom and dad are like relieved. They're like, we're so happy he's like making friends. And I totally understand where mom and dad are coming from. That's what weed used to be, right? It used to be the shy kid who opened up a little bit more if he took a hit of a joint. But that's not what it is anymore, right? And the parents believe that. They believe like, Doc, why are you going crazy over this? This is nothing.
Yeah, I get that all the time. And like, and then, this just tumbles into a whole thing too. Like it's just very different now. Where are where is some of this weed coming from? What's it being cultivated with? You see some of the lab testing that we could find online, that some major news organizations have gone and purchased a bunch of black market cartridges and products, and they come back with some really nasty pesticides and some really, really nasty ingredients. So that's the thing too. Like, it's not like, I don't know. When I used to buy weed, like, I had a buddy who like lived around the corner who was like growing it, like, and it was just like a little bit, and it was nothing crazy. It was just nothing crazy. It's like a whole big operation now, and it's I don't know. It's very scary. It's just very, very, and there's all these different strains now too. So it's like we got Delta 9, Delta 8, Delta 10, THC acetate, and they're combining all these different strands, and it's like it's just very different. It's very different.
Yeah, yeah, and so for myth number 3, this is really for the parents of these teens who are like, it's all right. Like he could have a little weed. Like I won't look the other way. But I'm gonna get into why the THC concentration is a problem. So that's kind of like at least my reasons for talking about this. I did want to introduce psychosis and schizophrenia, and this is the sciencey part of the talk, right? So, hold on to your seatbelts and maybe, if it's not that hard, I promise. Like, I know I'm a doctor. I'm not that smart, to be quite honest with you. I just like learn this over time. So I think you'll be able to follow through. And Frank, please interrupt at any time.
Definitely.
Psychosis. Psychosis is not a diagnosis. It's a syndrome, and a syndrome is a cluster of symptoms. So far, so good. These symptoms, at a minimum, include delusions and hallucinations, and these are called positive symptoms of psychosis. So, positive and negative symptoms, really briefly, positive is not like a good thing. Positive means added to you, right? So you get a delusion added to your thought content. You get a hallucination added to your perceptual perception, just your perception. There you go. So delusions are false fixed beliefs that do not change in the face of evidence. So in psychosis attributable to THC or schizophrenia, it's often persecutory delusions. So sometimes you feel like you're being followed or tracked, or people are conspiring against you. There's cameras in your room. There's cameras in the wall, right? There's cameras watching you everywhere, right? That could be kind of like the paranoia that presents with these delusions. Hallucinations are sensory perceptual disturbances where someone is experiencing something that is not reflecting any actual external stimulus. The most common ones in psychosis and substance-induced psychosis and schizophrenia are auditory hallucinations. Look, I will tell you, one of the first patients I ever had in residency when I was working in inpatient was a young man who he had lost like 30 pounds over 2 months. He was sitting in his room, perma-stoned on a vape THC cartridge all day. He lost that much weight because he believed his mom and dad were trying to poison him. And I asked him about this. Why do you think mom is trying to poison you? And he said the food tasted extra salty one day, and that really threw me off. And so he believed mom was putting out of all things like magnesium and aluminum in the food, trying to poison him. Another thing that I actually find quite often is holes in the walls of the patient's room. And I'll tell you why that's happening. People start to hear voices, and they're so real and vivid that there must be someone behind the wall. Right? I've seen that.
That's wild.
I've seen that at least 5 or 6 times. The same story. Holes in the wall. Right? They're punching holes through the wall because there must be something behind the wall whispering to me. Right? These voices that they're hearing, they're not, encouraging things. They're usually whispers, gibberish, or like really, really scary, nasty stuff, right? Like, you're a piece of crap. Like, you should kill yourself. Yes. Your parents are out to get you. Watch out, right? Like, this is, and that is extremely unsettling when you're already feeling a bit disorganized.
I get a lot of the parents are out to get you when I've worked with, and to be clear, I like don't work with psych. That's just not, once I identified, I'm like, you guys got to do something else. But that's one of the things I pick up on a lot. A lot of times I'm talking to people and it's my parents are out to get me. My parents are trying to kill me. Sometimes it's more violent. I have to get my parents before my parents get me. Like, it's a really scary, it's really, really freaky. But I've heard that with the whole parents thing. I've seen that more than once.
Yeah, and look, psychosis scrambles your brain in a sense where meaning is inappropriately attributed to things that are not meaningful. And the best way I could put it is, if you smile at me and like nod your head, you are just doing like a friendly gesture. I might not even notice it because it's so human. It's like stimulus that I would ignore. Psychosis, because it disorganizes you, I might get the sense that like Frank is giving me a sign, like that meant like they're coming. Like, who's coming? right? What's going on, right? That is it is very unsettling because you are not sure what is relevant and what is not relevant anymore, right? And there's a sort of fear around it. And we've all experienced psychosis to some degree before. And I find I've always wondered what it was like to experience psychosis. And I think just based on the experience I work with patients and what I read about it, the closest thing to a psychotic experience that healthy people experience on a regular basis is dreaming. Right? In a dream, we kind of accept the reality that is foisted upon us in the dream, right? I could be dreaming that I'm seeing my 18-year-old kid graduate high school, and I look over next to me, and it's not my wife. It's like some other woman who's like my third wife, and I just accept that in the dream, right? I'm not like shocked that where did my first wife go, right? That is just the reality in the dream, and you don't question it. It's just that's the way it is. Or you're in a dream at somebody's funeral, somebody really close to you, and you're like, I didn't even get a chance to mourn this person, but you're not reacting to that. You're just like, yeah, I already mourned them, right? And then you wake up and you're like, whoa, what the heck was that? Psychosis is like that while you're awake, all the time.
I think that's a fantastic explanation of it, especially for anyone who might have a family member struggling with it, because, so often it's like, why don't they get it? Why don't they see that I'm not trying to poison them? I like what you said about it's just their reality. And at the moment, they just accept it as is, as in dreaming. I think that's a very good way to describe that.
Yeah. Yeah. And we'll talk a little bit more about exactly what schizophrenia does. So what causes psychosis, right? Obviously I'm going to be talking about how cannabis causes psychosis, but cannabis is not the only culprit here, right? Substances or medications. So THC, PCP, cocaine, methamphetamine, and withdrawing from alcohol can cause psychotic experiences. Psychosis can also occur due to prescribed medications, and a lot of them are psych medications. Stimulants can cause psychosis. SSRIs can cause psychosis. Corticosteroids, right? Like prednisone.
I didn't know that.
10% of people can develop psychosis on corticosteroids. It's a common consult in the hospital. When somebody's on high dose steroids, they start believing that there's somebody out to get them.
That's fascinating. From a chiropractic standpoint, that's fascinating to me. I don't know. I don't want to get off topic here. Like the methylprednisone packs that they might give to someone for pain. Could that short of a duration?
Yes, I have seen it. I have seen it.
Wow.
I have seen it before. Yes. But
I did not know that.
The thing is, it doesn't last long enough because the 5-day packs go really short, really quick.
Yes.
It doesn't last long enough for somebody to do something like really bizarre, but occasionally it happens. And I'll tell you, a lot of people don't even know that's a side effect of corticosteroids.
I had no idea.
Are.
And I've been, I can't prescribe, but I've been talking to people about corticosteroids, and I see people prescribe them all the time. I've seen people act really strange. Like, some people get really hyper. Some people might get tired. Like, I've seen people react differently over the years, but I did not know that was a thing. Interesting.
Yep. And people with Parkinson's, they take carbidopa, levodopa like Sinemet and amantadine. And these are dopamine agonists, right? They increase dopamine in the brain, and they can also cause psychotic experiences, right? So it that also happens, right? I've seen that as well. Psychiatric and medical conditions where psychosis is present. So it's a core feature of schizophrenia, but it can also occur in depression, OCD, bipolar disorder, and borderline personality disorder. Psychosis is ubiquitous in psychiatric illness. And psychosis can also occur in purely medical illnesses, such as NMDA encephalitis. Famous movie Brain on Fire. That's a case of NMDA encephalitis, and it goes through a psychotic experience. People with seizure disorders, epilepsy can have psychotic episodes. People with autoimmune disorders like lupus, sarcoidosis, they can have psychotic episodes. Pregnancy and postpartum psychosis is a very real thing, and it's not talked about a lot. And Lewy body dementia. That one is famous for visual hallucinations, but they'd also develop psychosis. A lot of the dementias have psychosis. So, and I'll, and you know, you might be seeing this, right? It's like, wow, psychosis is a lot caused by a lot of things, right? Like steroids, we didn't even know that. Uh, all of these medical illnesses. Well, I don't know anyone who's had psychosis, but the data will show you 1 in 11 people will experience psychosis in their lifetime. It is actually a common phenomena that occurs.
You know what's
Go
interesting
ahead.
to
Go
me
ahead, Frank.
too? It makes me wonder when I see stuff, and I'm not. This is not literature based. This is Frank speaking. Like it makes me think. You have someone who smoked a lot of weed. They get pregnant. They decide to stop smoking during pregnancy. They're postpartum now. Maybe they're going through postpartum problems and issues and depressions and things. Maybe that happens. They start smoking again now heavily because they're postpartum. I'd almost wonder, like, is there potentially a higher risk of psychosis for that person? Or it makes me even think of something simpler, like someone has lupus or like a lot of people with autoimmune disorders consume cannabis for actual pain relief or the perception of pain relief for whatever reason, right? And it makes me wonder, like, is that potentially a risk factor? And is that risk factor multiplied with cannabis? And again, I have no idea if there's literature on that. That's just what goes through my head right now. And especially with, obviously, I think that's a little more obvious, medications. I at least to me, that would be obvious, but maybe not to someone else. Hey, I'm on long-term steroid treatment, which you don't see very often anymore, like corticosteroid treatment for an autoimmune disease. Now, let's say you have lupus, long-term steroid treatment, and you're consuming really high concentration THC. That person might be thinking, well, I'm at no risk of psychosis. That doesn't run in my family. I've never had an episode before. But it's like, wait a minute, would the lupus and the long-term steroid treatment qualify you as an increased risk? I don't know. That's what's going through my head when I see this. More people might be at risk than they realize. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, and certainly there could be like an additive quality. I know certainly people who use stimulants like Adderall, Vyvanse, like if I prescribe those, the risk of developing psychosis if you use that and smoke weed is very high, right?
Wow.
And I often tell people it's like driving 90 miles per hour is not a guaranteed car accident. Adding Adderall, so 90 miles per hour is the marijuana. Adding Adderall is like closing your eyes. Like it's not a matter of when you are going to crash. It's not a matter of if you are. It is when you are going to, right? So that is certainly additive. I will tell you from that perspective. That is 100% additive.
Wow. Do you, and I'm not asking what you do medically, I'm just asking, is this like a talked about thing in your space where, okay, say you have a younger person, they come in, they're heavy on the cannabis, and they're also now diagnosed with ADHD. Do physicians, do they take that into consideration when they're making the prescription for the ADHD meds, that there's heavy cannabis use, or maybe not always? And I'll actually just be blunt about this. I've worked with tons of students. I work in high schools, and they'll be like, I smoke weed because I have ADHD. It's undiagnosed. They go and they get it diagnosed. They're still smoking a ton of weed, but now they've thrown ADHD medications into the mix. I see this all the time. And there was no discussion of, I mean, I hate to say it, but sometimes even the cannabis use is encouraged. It's like, well, if that's helping you with your anxiety, like keep smoking that. We're going to treat the ADHD now and it's going to be fine. I see that like often.
You know what's sad, Frank, is like marijuana is not cool to talk bad about, right? And I'll tell you why it's not. Because there's a political element to it, right? I do not get any cool points for being like an internet narc here, right? I would be so much cooler if I was like, yeah, weed is awesome, man. Like, whatever. I'm not knocking it because I'm like wagging my finger at people. I'm knocking it because it is dangerous. Like if it worked, I would say listen, on my TikTok and Instagram, I actually talk about some useful supplements all the time. L-theanine, right? I talk about SAMe. I talk about apigenin, right? I like natural stuff. Trust me, I would prefer. I actually always tell my patients this one line: I am actively trying to work myself out of a job. I don't want you to come back here. I want you to figure it out without me. But weed is not going to help you out with that, right? In the overwhelming majority of cases, it's not going to be the answer for you. And I'm not knocking it because of like some personal belief. Unfortunately, a lot of doctors are woefully ignorant about how dangerous THC is.
Yeah, and I tell people too, and I'm like, look, you have to remember, everyone's going to have a little bias. Like, for all you know, that physician really enjoys smoking weed with their husband or wife at night, and it's been something they've been doing for years, and there might be a little bit of bias there. Like, that's just the way, that's just the reality, you know? And then who knows?
Yeah.
You might have someone like me, and maybe I'm a little bit of bias on the other side, like a little more against it because of my perceptions of it. Like, I too try and stay evidence-based, even though it's something I never talk about on my channel, but my channel is more, you know, motivational, helping people quit stuff. But I always tell people that I'm like, just realize, like, even physicians have had their own personal experiences. And if a physician has had a great experience with cannabis thus far in their life, or they had one in the past, there might be a little bit of bias when they're telling you, like, I've had this. When I had CHS, they were like, oh, the weed should be like helping your stomach. Like, that was the first commentary I heard. Like, oh, it's usually good for like stomach pain, so we don't think that's it, you know? And I'm like, I just can't help but to wonder, like, did that physician have a good experience with cannabis when they were using it? So like, they just kind of assumed like, you'll be fine with that. I had a dentist once. You said your brother's a dentist. I had a dentist once, and I used to chew tobacco heavily too. And I go to see my friend's dad. My gum is bleeding, and I'm freaking out. And I'm like, my gum's bleeding. I'm like at his house, you know, because we knew him. Now, mind you, my friend's dad chain smokes cigarettes like a fiend, okay? And like, he's a dentist. And he looks at me, he looks in my mouth. He's like, it looks like a kernel of a popcorn or something. He's like, that shit, the chewing tobacco. He's like, that shit won't kill you. And I was like, oh, good. I feel good about that. And I'm like, Frank, I understand this guy's a dentist, but now this is me reflecting back years later. You're asking a man, he's a human being just like anyone else, who chain smokes cigarettes. Of course, he's not going to openly bash chewing tobacco with you. He, like, you know, he has a little bit of bias. He's chain smoking when he's not seeing you. He likes tobacco. So anyways.
And you know what? My own bias, I've had colleagues of mine actually tell me this, and it's very true. Joe, you don't see people who smoke cannabis who are not in the hospital, who are not in your office. You don't see them, right? And you're right. I don't. But unfortunately, I have seen more frequent people who should never be in psychiatric care in my office after they started ramping up THC use, right? Like, well, and the message that they, you know, I've had patients who I really worked on getting them to stop, and then I'll see them kind of like deteriorate. What, did you start smoking again? And they're like, you know, I did. It's like, and I noticed my nausea got worse, and my sleep got worse, and my OCD got worse. Like, well, maybe let's put two and two together there, right? I'm not just annoying you when I talk about this, right? I actually want you to do better. Schizophrenia. So schizophrenia is a chronic, debilitating, and serious mental illness characterized by chronic psychotic symptoms. And I put chronic twice there, but I meant to also put progressive. So I want to be very clear. Schizophrenia is a neurobiological degenerative disorder, meaning schizophrenia is literally, your brain is deteriorating. In the first 5 years of schizophrenia, your brain mass deteriorates by 2% a year, and then 0.25% every year thereafter. Right? So schizophrenia, when it's untreated, psychosis is like a neuroinflammatory process that atrophies your cerebral cortex. Right? It is actually sort of like a dementia, but an early dementia. In fact, schizophrenia's first name was dementia precox by Emil Kraepelin, some guy in 1900s. And the word schizophrenia, just to break it down, in its root, schizo means split. Phren means mind, right? So schizophrenia is split mind disorder. And it's called that because people with schizophrenia vacillate between psychotic and non-psychotic. And in psychosis, you have a hard time differentiating reality from not reality, like in a dream, right? So that is schizophrenia, though, is not a one-time psychotic episode. It's a continuous life of that. It affects roughly 1% of the population worldwide. And in the US, that's about 3.5 million people. In the majority of cases, it causes severe or permanent disability. You know, people with schizophrenia, once again, this is a neurodegenerative disorder. You're not necessarily continuing school. You're not necessarily able to function in the same capacity that you could before. In many ways, it's like developing dementia in your 20s, right? It's a very awful thing to happen. It shortens life expectancy by 13 to 15 years, and typically that's due to the disorganization that schizophrenia causes. Among other things, I've seen as high as 20 years. Lifetime risk for suicide attempts are 20 to 50%, which is it's an insane thing to think about, right? I've seen the 50%. That is 50% of people, or 25, 1 in 4 people who develop schizophrenia attempt suicide. About 10% complete suicide, right? If we're looking at the 3.5 million people number, that's 350,000 people completing suicide in the context of schizophrenia. And I'll tell you something. The reason why the risk factors for suicide and schizophrenia is actually higher IQ, male sex, any other substance use involved. Higher IQ, because what ends up happening is when they get a little bit better and realize that they are having a psychotic episode or a psychotic experience, the reality sets in of what's to come.
Yep.
Right. And I want to, this last point, the overwhelming majority of attempts and completed suicides occur near illness onset. Now, if I smoke weed and become psychotic, right, I'll go to the inpatient unit, they'll load me up on antipsychotics, and that psychosis will calm down. Do I have schizophrenia? Maybe. It is too early to tell. It'll take some time before you could tell I have schizophrenia. Now, if you are in this episode and you are just having a substance-induced psychosis, you don't know. So I've had this exact experience. Patient will come to me after their discharge and they say, well, doc, what does this mean? Their parents, what does this mean going forward? Well, I don't know. You might have schizophrenia.
Terrifying.
You might, this might result. So now, and the reason why I highlighted that last point, who's going to wait to find out? A lot of these people, even with just substance-induced psychosis, end up killing themselves or attempting to kill themselves. And it's a horrifying thing. It's a horrifying thing.
Yeah, and I know, and to talk about cannabis, I know that there is literature available out there with the higher rates of suicide and self-inflicted harm among cannabis users. And I know that there's literature out there correlating cannabis use to schizophrenia, especially out of like Canada. I know there's a lot of literature on that stuff.
I'm going to go through some of that. I'm going to go through some of that with you. So we've laid out psychosis, schizophrenia. What is going on with the neurochemistry when someone has schizophrenia? And this is the sciencey part, so bear with me, right? There's so many hypotheses for how schizophrenia develops. The earliest hypothesis is the dopamine hypothesis, and then there's serotonin and glutamate and cannabinoid and stress inflammation and microbiome, genetic, neurodevelopmental, and muscarinic hypothesis, right? And there's actually more than just this, just to be very clear. And the answer is not one or the other. I think there is a good mix of all of it. If you were to ask me my opinion on it. But we'll go through at least very briefly, not to overwhelm with the biochemistry, very briefly just go through dopamine, serotonin, and glutamate. And it's one slide. So, but first let's introduce dopamine. That's dopamine. That's what it looks like. one of the fundamental human neurotransmitters. It acts throughout the body, not just in the brain. It's a vasodilator. It increases sodium excretion, urine output. That's why people who are taking Adderall need to watch their water, need to drink more. Reduces insulin production in the pancreas, reduces gastric motility. That's why you're not as hungry, among other reasons. In the brain, outside of the psychiatric context, it modulates movement and is a main player in movement disorders such as Parkinson's. We talked about amantadine and Sinemet earlier. So these hypotheses of schizophrenia. All right, bear with me. Hyperactive dopamine activity in D2-like receptors equals psychosis. So why did we figure that out? I will tell you. In the 1950s or 60s or 40s, they saw people who used methamphetamines develop a paranoid psychosis similar to those who have schizophrenia, right? Who have a paranoid psychosis. So theory is, okay, well, dopamine must be causing. Now, they didn't have advanced imaging, but I think they knew that this substance did something with dopamine. Yep. So they said, okay, well, it must be dopamine related in the mesolimbic pathway. And I'm not going to get into the neuroanatomy about this, but the rationale over time with advanced imaging, more research, showed that dopamine is definitely, so hyperactivity of dopamine in the D2 receptor in the brain causes a psychotic, at least positive psychotic symptoms. But glutamate and serotonin and GABA and NMDA also, and glutamate is with NMDA, and I'll get into a little bit of that, but that all ties in to increasing dopamine in D2 receptors. So we have 5 dopamine receptors. D1, they're very creatively named, D1 through D5. D1 and D5 act similarly. D2 through D4 act similarly. So D2-like receptors are talking about D2, 3, and 4. And their activity does the inverse of each other, but it's a very, I just don't want to get into that story too much, but I just wanted to give an introduction. So the dopamine hypothesis, dopamine hyperactivity at the D2 receptors in the mesolimbic pathway extends from the VTA to the ventral striatum, neuroanatomy. NMDA receptor hypoactivity on GABAergic interneurons in the prefrontal cortex. So NMDA receptor hypoactivity is caused by glutamate downregulation. So glutamate is the gas pedal in your brain. It is excitatory. So lower glutamate on the NMDA receptor, causing GABA to be downregulated in the prefrontal cortex, is like taking your foot off the gas. I mean, taking your foot off the brake. That is what is happening in number 2, right? So I know that sounds confusing. So one more time, glutamate is going forward. Mm-hmm. Blocking glutamate, but what is it going forward at, right? It is going forward at GABA. GABA calms you down. Mm-hmm. So I am blocking the thing that activates the brakes. Mm-hmm. That increases, that has a downstream effect, which increases dopamine in D2-like receptors, right? Serotonin hyperactivity on glutamate neurons in the cerebral cortex also lead to this downstream effect. The brain is a very difficult thing to study because it is so interconnected that one thing that might seem irrelevant to the primary function of another thing is directly causing that issue, right? So this is why there's so many hypotheses of schizophrenia, because how many interconnections are related to the dopamine receptors, right? There's a lot. So there's always new data, and this stuff is actually like super interesting. I mean, to me at least. But it what I'm trying to say is the brain is a very complicated place, right? Everyone's feeling a little bit more irritable and agitated because the sun goes down at 4 p.m. Why is that, right? There's a connection there, but what is the reason? There's a little bit of a clinical humility I approach psychiatry with, right? Like, this might be in the book, but this is the person sitting in front of me who's experiencing something totally different.
Yeah. Yeah, the human body is this is one of the main reasons why I don't smoke anymore. I just look at the brain and all the stuff that goes on in the brain, and I'm like, I just don't want to mess with anything that could potentially screw that up more than life already does. Like you said, as simple as the sun going down at 4 o'clock. Yeah, the day is more depressing at the end of the day after that, in my opinion, when the sun goes down like that. I'm not a huge fan of the darkness, right? So when I look at smoking, and I smoke a lot, I'm like, I just don't want to compound that with anything else that's going to further mess with my glutamate, my GABA, my serotonin. There's enough things to trip it up throughout the day. I don't need to add more complications to that.
Yeah. It's the last doctor you should trust is a doctor who tells you they know it all, right? That's the guy you should run away from.
Yes. And when you look at this too, people are all different, right? Like people have genetic differences, right? Like when it comes to this stuff, I'm sure, I remember in anatomy class when we do dissections on the cadavers, it'd be like, oh, this nerve or this artery should be here. This muscle should run like this. And then, they're like, oh, look at this person. It doesn't go that way. It looks like they had this connection that was made in their body over the years to adapt for whatever genetic defect they had. And it's like, oh, wow, we're all similar, but we're all quite different. And I assume the brain is, there's like a baseline, but like, if I took my brain and your brain, they would probably look quite different under like the finest details of them, so
right. So THC, those are the molecules. So Frank, I'll ask you to guess which one you think THC is, because those are two separate molecules.
It's funny, I should know the answer to that right away, and I'm going with the top one.
50-50 shot. It's the bottom one.
Damn.
So I will tell you. Yeah, that's good. Good, right?
Yeah.
The human hormones or human molecules tend to be very redundant. Like how long the tail on that chemical structure is. So that chemical structure is an anandamide, right?
Okay.
And that is something that interacts with our natural endocannabinoid system, right? So whenever oh my God, I have so many people on the TikTok and Instagram comments, look up the endocannabinoid system and do your homework. All right. We have something called an endocannabinoid system. Great. What does that mean? That means we should be using cannabis. We have opiate receptors. Yes. That doesn't mean we should be using opiates, right?
That's always my comeback. Yeah, we have nicotinide or whatever receptors and all that, but nicotine binds to this and yeah.
So anandamide interacts with our endocannabinoid system in our brain. However, THC has a much tighter affinity to our CB1 and CB2 receptor, which is our cannabinoid receptor. And when it does that, it does many things. So when I say greater affinity in cell biology or molecular biology, right? If something has greater affinity, and affinity means like how tightly it binds, right? If imagine me and you, Frank, we're both single bachelors out there, and you're a very good looking guy, and I am not a very good looking guy, and there is a girl that you and I are both interested in. If you have a higher affinity, even if I'm with her, you're getting her. So even if poor me, anandamide, is dating this girl, but here we go, THC Frank comes by, and he has the tightest affinity, I'm actually going to get knocked off the receptor.
Yeah.
Right? So you sabotage your brain's natural, homeostasis with that. And it's, binding is one thing, but when the simplest way I could put it is when something binds to a receptor, that's not important. It's what happens after. It's downstream effect that leads to inhibition and release of certain neurotransmitters. And dopamine is coming back, right? Why we had that whole discussion about dopamine. And also it downregulates CB receptor density. So another thing here, people who have like tolerance to weed, who don't get high anymore on a hit, they are doing the wax to get high.
Yes.
And the more you use of something, and this is just a general principle, your body's always aiming for homeostasis. It's always trying to correct. So if you are flooding your brain with THC, your brain is like, all right, we don't need this much cannabinoid receptors because there's a ton of THC around. So your body actually destroys your receptor as a result. People who use cocaine are like, can develop like a chronic, persistent, melancholic depression because their dopamine receptors are super shot, right? They're downregulated. So they can't experience physiological joy anymore. And that tends to improve over time, but that's kind of why they're persistently depressed.
And it can cause, for some cases, some people may not improve. I remember, not that that's the message I think I'm trying to give to people, but like seriously though, if you're thinking about quitting and you're worried about this stuff, maybe that is a motive. Like, oh, I didn't know that was a potential side effect. That is scary. I remember, I think it was Dr. Anna Lemke. She's a psychiatrist at Stanford Medicine. And she wrote the book Dopamine Nation. And I interviewed her and she was like, yeah, in some small cases, there are people who won't be able to fully recover their dopamine receptors. The damage has been too extensive.
Look, I believe in the power of like neuroplasticity in the body. And look, I generally, I'll put it this way, I think there are people who do recover the majority of the time, right?
Yeah.
I think it's very rare you find people who don't get better, right?
Yeah.
That they've shot their dopamine receptors, and this is not even talking about marijuana. This is talking about like cocaine. I've seen people get better past that, and over time, your body's resilient in many ways, especially if you feed it correctly and you exercise correctly and you get enough water and you really take care of yourself. Your body will take care of you back. So I'm pretty optimistic about people who are willing to work, because that's what it takes.
Yeah, I would agree.
Just to wrap up the endocannabinoid system. So look, the endocannabinoid system is very ubiquitous throughout the entire brain, and it does a bunch of things, right? It's physiological, cognitive processes, fertility, pregnancy, pre and postnatal development, various things in the immune system, appetite, pain sensation, mood, and memory. So someone might say like, wow, like this is a under like researched part of the brain. I actually would look at that and say, yeah, maybe that is an under researched part of the brain, but that should really freak you out, right? If you are messing with a system that deals with those many things and you are like kind of experimenting on it, now you know why I'm kind of worried about this, right? This is different, right? Like this is a whole human that you're messing with.
Yeah. When people say they're like, cannabis has no, and I don't even really care about the difference between physical and psychological addiction, but people argue, they're like, oh, you can't have anything physical happen from withdrawals from cannabis. I'm like, wait a minute. But then you go and tell me that the endocannabinoid system, this is the same educated person arguing with me. They're like, well, you got to understand, it regulates sleep, it regulates digestion, it regulates mood, it regulates, bone growth. You can find it in cardiac tissue. And they're like, it doesn't have any physical effects during withdrawal. I'm like, how are you saying that? You just told me in the same sentence, it regulates like a million different physical aspects of a person's development and functioning. Like, of course there can be physical withdrawal to it. It binds to your central nervous system. THC can bind at a higher affinity, from what I'm understanding, to, maybe that's the correct wording, a preferable affinity.
No, that was perfect. That was perfect. That was perfect. Yeah.
To the brainstem. Like, what are you talking about? It's not going to have effects. Like that's real. That's actually scary powerful, in my opinion. I don't think alcohol binds to. I don't even know what alcohol binds. I don't even. And we don't need to get into the science of alcohol. But I don't think alcohol has receptors in that many areas.
It's one receptor. It's one receptor. It's GABA. It's GABA.
Okay.
It's GABA A. Yeah.
Which understandably, okay, that can impact a lot of different functions, I would assume, in the body. But like, yeah, like, I mean, there's literally receptors on your heart, in your GI tract, in your skin, like literally everywhere, from what I understand, for THC, like everywhere.
Right.
So anyways.
Right. Look, that's beside the point, right? So not to belabor how THC directly activates dopamine release. You could look up those studies yourself if you want to read them, but you could take my word for it or read those studies yourself. I don't want to get too much into that. I actually didn't even mention this in this slide. However, THC also downregulates glutamate. Remember, we talked about glutamate on the second,
Yes.
the glutamate hypothesis. We downregulate glutamate. What are we doing, right? We are also going down the road of schizophrenia, right? So once again, right, there's multiple culprits. There's multiple actions that THC is taking that are leading down this path of a psychotic experience. And you know, this is the biochemistry of it. This should kind of we're laying the groundwork, right, for this is my next slide. We've laid the theoretical groundwork now for THC causing psychosis. But what does the empirical data say? Right? Dr. Alfar, your hand waving is very nice. You are use a lot of fancy words and you think you're smarter than everybody and you're really annoying. Let's see the data. Fine. Let's see the data. Multi-center study across many countries in Europe, published in 2019, and this was the inclusion criteria of the patients. It was 1,200 people, and it was only 1,200 because of how tight the inclusion criteria was. It was first time psychotic episode, no prior treatment for psychosis, right? No prior history. They interviewed these people and took a retrospective history. What were you kind of doing beforehand? What would you guess the odds ratio is? Like what percentage of what if I use marijuana and you don't use marijuana, what is the likelihood that I end up in this group of 1,200 people?
I use marijuana and you don't. What's the likelihood
Right.
that you fit this group?
Yeah. What's the chance that I'll be in that group versus someone who doesn't use at all?
I would think it's very, very low, but
So the opposite. Sorry. Like I use it every day. You don't.
you use it every day. Oh, okay. I would think
Yeah.
it's much higher. I would think the person who doesn't use it, the chances are very, very low. I would think the person who's using it every day, the chances are much higher.
It's 5 times higher.
5 times. That's significant.
The
Yeah,
odds
that's
ratio
very,
was
that qualifies as very higher.
4.8. Yeah, 480% increase in representation of the first break psychosis cohort. Right?
Wow.
And
that's insane.
In that study, going back to THC and concentrations, in that study, they actually found out what they were smoking. Here's the graph. So London, Amsterdam, and Paris, all the way on the right is daily use of THC over 10% concentration. Always higher. Now, another investigation of this chart is don't look at the furthest graph as the green, the one, then there's like 2 over. The purple one, I'm really bad with colors. The purple one I think is a little higher. It's the second highest, right? In Amsterdam and London at least. And what was that showing? If you point it to the color code legend up top, is that's used strong THC more than once a week.
Yeah, more than once a week.
But the person to the right of that uses lower dose THC daily. So there's also this fallacy that I don't smoke all the time. I just smoke on weekend. Right? I smoke once a month. Well, look, the THC that you're smoking, if it is strong, you are likely to be going to the hospital anyway due to psychosis, right? It is not one time, it is not chronic use that causes issues all the time. It's actually heavy content. I actually encourage
the
patients
strength
sometimes.
Seems to be a bigger indicator of that. That's actually really interesting because that answers something that I've always so although I struggled with cannabis substance use disorder, addiction, whatever, I only smoked in the evenings. I was very lightweight, maybe with an occasional weekend, something like that. I wouldn't smoke a lot by standard seller people, but I wound up CHS. I wound up with, an acute state of psychosis for a minute there. And it was always fascinating to me because I was like, I'll smoke a lot, but I was smoking really strong stuff. I had the vapes and all that stuff. So that to me is fascinating. Because maybe that was more, that's interesting. I never thought about that. The strength being a larger predictor. And people say it all the time. They're like, yeah, well, if you don't do it, to your point, if you don't do it a lot, it's probably not going to happen to you. Well, actually, according to this chart, no, the strength might be a stronger predictor of that. That's fascinating.
Yeah. And aside from psychosis and the development of schizophrenia, is there really any other harm? Right? I get this comment every now and then. I use THC. I never developed psychosis, so it's harmless otherwise. Stop fear mongering. Okay. Addiction. Is marijuana addictive? There's the data on it. Hyperemesis syndrome. There's the data on it. Cardiac damage. There's the data on it. Loss of fulfillment in life and overall lower life fulfillment. There's the data on it. In pregnancy, so this study was actually very interesting. This was a very large study, and this is just one of the papers that they produced. Fetuses exposed to THC had a higher likelihood of all psychiatric illnesses in adolescent years.
Wow.
Every single one, right?
Wow.
And they developed actually psychotic prone thinking, which I'm not sure exactly how they measured that, but there's a psychometric test for everything. This was a very large study, and the effects of cannabis on pregnancy and the fetus is devastating. And THC and the effects on sleep. And the last thing is I want to say on sleep. People, when they stop using cannabis, they report extremely vivid dreams, like REM sleep overdrive.
Mm-hmm.
And it's because THC blocks REM sleep. And blocking REM sleep, look, REM sleep is like crucial for your brain's health. It is actually the time in your brain where your brain kind of like cleans things up. If you block REM sleep, you are like not actually resting. You are not actually getting your brain is not getting a chance to clean itself in a sense. And THC also plays a trick in which it'll help you sleep, and then one day it won't.
Yeah.
And then people really start to panic. So, I think the effects on sleep are probably some of the most devastating when it comes to THC. Here's all of the references, and Frank, I'll email this over to you. I'll put you on
This
a
is great.
contributor. Yeah. I
would love to see these and maybe even make some individual videos about some of those references too. You said something about REM sleep. You made me think. I was watching this. I think he's a PhD, Dr. something Walker, sleep expert.
Oh, Matthew Walker. Yeah,
Matthew
he's
Walker.
great.
That's him. So I was
Yeah.
listening to one of his things it was a Joe Rogan podcast, and he's saying, look, with alcohol, if you deprive your body of REM sleep enough, and I don't know if he was talking about DTs with alcohol or what the deal was, but he was basically saying, he was like, once you deprive yourself long enough through alcohol, because I think he described alcohol as like a sedative versus like something that's actually giving you sleep. He was like, it's knocking you out, but you're not actually sleeping. He was like, essentially what happens is your body just craves REM sleep so intensely that one day you're going to wake up and you're going to be living in real life IRL, but like in a state of dream sleep. He was like, your body's going to force you. And I don't know if he was getting at that's what psychosis is, or that's what disassociation is, or if that's what DTs are. But and then he drew some conclusion at the end, which would be really important to know what that conclusion is for the purpose of our conversation. But it was something along those lines. He was like, if you don't sleep and you don't get REM sleep, your body's going to force you into it when you're awake, and it's going to be a horrible experience. And he was just saying, this is what we see with alcohol. And then I was like, well, geez, in theory, if cannabis blocks REM sleep, wouldn't you have a very similar outcome with cannabis too? So anyways, you just made me think of that when we were talking about REM sleep.
Yeah. No, I mean, look, alcohol is absolutely horrific for sleep, and alcohol actually can kill you if you detox off it cold turkey.
Yes.
Whereas THC doesn't kill you per se, it just makes your life very uncomfortable. And I guess a part two, if you were ever interested in that, and I don't want to take too much of your time, we would talk about like, well, what is it that what is now the approach to treatment, right, for somebody who's either actively psychotic or wanting to stop marijuana?
Yeah, you know what? We have to do a part two on that if you're open to it, because that's a major issue, actually. I don't know if I love how you did this, like evidence based on evidence, based on experience that you've had, because even just, like you said in the beginning, even though what we're doing isn't medical advice to people, if we could at least give people something to approach their primary care with, their physicians with, just to get the conversation started, might be really helpful. Because I've noticed with like the psychosis and this and that, like, um, some physicians, because it's not what they see, they don't even know where to start. Like, even I mean, I would think it'd be pretty obvious, like, okay, get the person to a psychiatrist and just get started there. That's probably the person best suited to handle this. But like, they don't even know where to begin. Like, what medications might I get put on, or what should I be inquiring about, or what should I be looking out for? Like, there's no information on that. So I think a part two on medical based treatments and things that are commonly used in practice or that we're seeing in the literature would be a fantastic part two. I would love that.
Frank, you are. Thank you for giving me the chance to talk about this. I hope that wasn't as disorganized as I felt like it was. And yeah, no, it would be my honor to do it. I appreciate it always, and I really do appreciate all the work you do.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I appreciate your work too. That's how I found you on TikTok. That's how I
Nice.
found you on TikTok, though. It's just, I think it's so important that physicians get on social media and start talking and just start getting information out there to people. It's like anything. Like, sometimes you get some physicians on TikTok and it's a little shady, but you know what? That's also real life. You got people who are putting out good things and bad things. Now it's just public on social media. But I always
Oh,
tell people it was always going on. Like,
my
but I think it's
my
great.
main my main thing on going on social media was like just the amount of horrendous mental health things that we're seeing on there. Like it was like, if you pick your nose with your left hand instead of your right, that's like a trauma response means you have ADHD. I'm like, what the heck is going on, man? Like who's, and people are like, oh my God, I pick my nose with my left hand all the time. Like, and it's like, oh, there's what it tells me is people are hungry for knowledge. People want to know about themselves. But the only people who are willing to talk about it are unfortunately people with, let's just say they're uninformed. The best
Yeah,
way to say it, right? And doctors, I know doctors, I am one. They're very reserved and like
it's a good way to put it.
old school people, right? Like they're very scared. And look, maybe I should be scared, right? I maybe some of these people will, be very upset by what I'm saying, but I truly only make the content to help some people out, to demystify psychiatry a little bit, right? Like I'm not a guy gonna lock you up in a chair if you don't
Yeah,
listen to me. Most psychiatrists, even if some of them are not that great, in my opinion, they are genuinely trying to help people. That's what we're all doing it for. So I just kind of want to bridge the gap a little bit and help people find or at least be open to getting help.
I love this. Listen, Joe, Dr. Alfar, I really appreciated this conversation and I look forward to doing a part two with you. So, guys, listen, if you're watching this YouTube video, I'm going to throw some links in the pinned comments in the video's description. If you want to do research and learn about that stuff, we'll put those links and those resources there. We will link Joe's social medias in the pinned comment as well too, if you want to follow him for more stuff. And then I will look forward to a part two in the future, guys. Once we put that up, I'll put that in the pinned comment too. We'll go back and do that in the future for you guys. Otherwise, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks, Frank.
Yeah, great. And then Joe, we can hang around. I'll end the recording there and I'll just get it